very scary and intimidating, a word like transcendental. It's got more than 2 syllables, which is something we're unfamiliar with, generally speaking these days, but it's a very simple idea. So the idea of the transcendentals is that it's a characteristic of something or reality of something that transcends. It goes above and beyond what we are accustomed to. It goes above and beyond ourselves. The transcendentals that we're going to speak of are rooted in Greek philosophy. The first people who really established the practice of thinking about life, examining life, they're one of the first cultures, certainly in the West, that had an established culture enough that people could stop running from wild animals and picking nuts and berries all day long. And they could stop. They could sit down. They could look at their life. They can think about things. And what they discovered was that as we ourselves experience, and this is what really makes all of this true, is that what they discovered back then is something that's still just as true for us today. That these transcendentals of truth, goodness, and beauty, are something that's experienced by all of humanity. That it's an intuitive understanding. That when something is true, set before our minds, it makes sense. When something is good that's set before our conscience, we recognize it as good. When something is beautiful that is perceived by our senses, it's so easy for us to stop and enjoy. This happens because we are all made for a particular purpose. We're all made to be with God. We're made by God, and we're made to be returned to God. And what we're going to discover through the course of this talk is that the transcendentals come from God. And so we have receptors in ourselves that enable us to receive those things that are of God naturally. Remember, we're taught that it is not that we first loved God, but that He first loved us. And so in order for us to be able to receive the love that God first gives to us before we ever return it to Him, He has to create us, make us in a way to receive that. He has to make us and create us in a way that we can receive Him. This is, of course, an image of the creation of Adam, which is so famously on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, created by Michelangelo. And what we see there is this symmetry between God and man. An image of God in man. Which means that what God is can be apprehended by man. We all seek these things. And 3 of these things, and in fact I would dare say that these 3 things can capture every other possible derivation of them. Truth, goodness, and beauty are these things that humanity, in and of their own creation, by the very fact that they are made human by God, receive these things intuitively. Have you ever had anybody come up to you as you're gazing out at a sunset and they'd say, "Gosh, that's ugly"? Nobody would do that. There are some things that they just strike us to the heart. And those things, hey, look at, see, we're made for God. There it is. I thought that whole thing was up there. There are some things that they just strike us. Let's take truth, for example. Talk about truth for a moment. Truth, when we speak of truth, we speak of our perception of reality. I'm going to throw something out to you that should be shocking, but it's only shocking because we have a shallow understanding. We do have a correct understanding, but it's shallow. All truth is, and now make sure the video doesn't cut out, because if you only get this first half, it's going to be a terrible heresy. All truth is relative. What? All truth is relative. Because truth is our reception of reality. It is relative in as much as it is related to our ability to receive facts as they exist in the world. Now, all humanity has a singular mode of knowing those things, a singular way of knowing them. So when I say truth is subjective, it's subjective in a universal way. Oftentimes when we talk about truth being subjective, we're talking about what's true for you is not true for me. That's not what I mean by this. What I mean by this is God has created a world, and He has made that world so that it can be received by us relative to the way that we as human beings receive it. You can see the philosophy in this. Who's lost? Because this is important. Good. I saw a couple really embarrassed hands just about right here. So the reality is objective, yes? If I, like Tobit, go blind, my perception of reality is going to change, yes? Is the reality itself going to change? This is when Christians say truth is objective, that's what they mean. We're actually misspeaking in a way when we say that. Truth is objective is what we want to say. What we really want to say is reality is objective. And sometimes our way of perceiving something can get messed up. And so we receive truth in a way that it is not. My subjective experience of the truth does not correctly correlate to the reality of truth. That's what we call error. But God is the source of everything that we call true. And the reason that humanity can be amazed at things that are true. Take something as radical as Einstein's theory of relativity. Take something as radical as Newton's laws of physics. Take something as radical as the discovery of a universal truth that is the Pythagorean Theorem. I'm using all math terms just because that's kind of what's my brain's stuck there right now. But you can look at things of physics. You can look at things of nature. You can look at things that are universally true. And when we see those, we not only does it click into our minds that, yes, 2 + 2 is 4. That actually exists. That actually is. And it's been so long since we've known that 2 + 2 is 4 that we've lost our initial amazement that we experienced when we were kids at the discovery of that. Think about the fact that I'm walking around on the ground here and I'm not floating away. Something is sticking my feet to the ground. Gravity. That's a truth. That's a reality. And we perceive that. And it amazes us. It amazes us that we can put a space station to orbit and not crash to the ground of the Earth so people can be up there floating around doing whatever they're spending billions of dollars to do up there. That's amazing. Our human spirit is made to see these things that God has made and be amazed at them. To just be amazed. Similarly, we have this transcendental of goodness. Goodness is seeing justice established. Justice is the root of goodness. And justice begets peace. When we see this, when we experience this in our souls, we don't question it. We don't have to bicker about it. We don't have to prove it. You see someone like Mother Teresa reaching out to a child that nobody else wants to touch. And touch his face with its boils and its bruises and its cuts and tears and its sores. And she touches that face. A man leans down to take a loaf of bread from his own lunch pail and offer it to a poor man on the side of the road who has nothing to eat. Who argues about the goodness of these things? It's in us to identify these things as good. And we're working on it. Beauty. Beauty is perhaps the most important, relatively the most important, because as we experience these transcendentals, truth, goodness, and beauty, the one that has the biggest, and like Father Jack was talking about the Psalms, right? The engagement of the whole person, which includes the emotions. Because of our fallenness, our emotions are so strong. So strong. And our passions are engaged by things that are beautiful. Think of the effect gentlemen, think of the effect that a beautiful woman has from head to toe. When you see a beautiful woman. Ladies, when you see the expression of a man pouring himself out for his beloved, think of the emotion that washes over you. When any of us see a waterfall, think of the immense smallness that we feel at the magnitude of the beauty of that waterfall. These are things that we intuit. They are things that just as human beings, because they come from God, let's move on. Because they come from God, we experience them. But something we have to understand. God is not truthful. God is true. God is truth. Okay? He's not truthful. As if he has a characteristic that supersedes or transcends him. These are not transcendentals for God. God is truth. So our reception of that which is true is a reception of God. God isn't good. God is goodness. We can be good by cooperating in goodness. But God is not good as if he himself cooperates with goodness. He is goodness. Goodness is good because God is that thing that we call good. We recognize something as true not because God also shares in it, but because it comes from who he is, what he is. And God isn't beautiful. God is beauty. God is beauty. This is an interesting concept because we're talking about transcendentals. But again, transcendentals themselves are relative to us. These things that we're calling transcendentals are only transcendentals when we talk about them among ourselves. They're not transcendental to God. They're proper to God. They are who and what God is. God isn't good. He is goodness. God isn't true. He is truth. And God isn't beautiful. He is beauty. We only share in those. And when we share in those, we share in some way, some small portion, some imperfect way, in the truth that is God, in the goodness that is God, in the beauty that is God. That's why the Greek mind, thinking about reason, striving for logic, came up with some very profound truths that we today are talking about. That's why the Roman architects, in their search for strength and symmetry in their buildings, discovered beauty. And why even the Druids chanting around some Stonehenge, appreciating the natural wonder of the world, got something of goodness. And yet none of these got it all. The Greeks weren't totally right. They still had a pantheon. Just as an example of the many things that the Greeks got wrong. The Romans weren't totally beautiful. They were limited by their ability of industry to use certain materials that we have today to create things that are stronger, more symmetrical, and objectively more beautiful than the classical beauty of Roman architecture. And the Druids, the Druids got so much wrong. But because they themselves were made by God to be living in a world made by God, they perceived intuitively that this nature must be good. They just couldn't get beyond the nature to the source of the goodness. They were idolaters because they saw something that was in a tertiary or maybe in a secondary way good and failed to see what was beyond it. Right? God sees these imperfections in humanity and He wants to fix them. Because remember, we are made for God. We're made for Him. He wants us to be perfectly with Him. He wants us to be able to perfectly see Him, to know Him, to love Him. And so He has to take these transcendentals, these things that allow us to strike our hearts, these things that strike our souls, and recognize in them something beyond themselves, something that is beyond us, something that contains them. He wants us to be able to take that to ourselves and to know that, which is nothing shy of Himself. And so God takes the fullness of truth, the fullness of beauty, the fullness of goodness that is proper in Himself, and He sends to us Himself. He sends to us a manifestation of truth. He sends to us a manifestation of goodness and a manifestation of beauty. So that those human souls that have for so long recognized the God that is God by the goodness, the truth, and the beauty that they intuit by His creation can now look at the source of that for which they long. God has given us not only a window to look into the source of these things, but allows us the ability to take them into ourselves and for ourselves to be perfected by them. Christ is the manifestation of these things, and our cooperation, our possession of these transcendentals in our lives to fulfill the human soul that so yearns and desires for them, but to this point has only had them partially, is given to us through the church, which is the body of Him who possesses these things perfectly, who is these things perfectly. Now, I've said a lot of universal statements. Humanity naturally, universally experiences and recognizes truth, goodness, and beauty. And that is manifest in Christ Jesus in a perfect way that is also perceptible. Then why isn't everyone Catholic? And why aren't all Catholics perfect? If what I've said is true, we shouldn't have to ask this question. We have to understand that there's a tragedy in God's creation that He works with. That's our fallenness, our brokenness. Who expects to see a perfect image in a broken mirror? We struggle ourselves sometimes to even recognize what is supposed to be intuited perfectly by us. Because the world, the flesh, and the devil, these three sources of temptation, and by the way, folks, it's not all the devil, for crying out loud. It can also be yourself from inside your own brokenness, and it could also be the lure of the world. The allure of the world and its fallenness that can lead us into sin. Okay? The world, the flesh, and the devil seek to pervert, to distort, like a prism, these realities, these of truth, goodness, and beauty. Consider the album cover of Pink Floyd, the name of the album. What's the one with the prism on it? Dark Side of the Moon. I thought so, but I didn't want to risk it. The Dark Side of the Moon. Imagine that album cover, because we're going to talk about a prism for just a moment. God is light, John tells us. Perfect light. The perfect harmony between all of these colors, the diversity of the colors, all necessary in order to bring one beam of light into something that allows us to perceive reality in the way that it's meant to be perceived. White light allows us to see things correctly. But you stick a prism in front of it and it fractures that unity. It's still light, but it's fractured, it's disjointed, it is manipulated. But it is still light, and so we can still see things through it, but we see things incorrectly. So why is it then that while we still can recognize truth, we can still recognize goodness, we can still recognize beauty, sometimes we can be convinced that something that actually isn't good is good. Something that actually isn't true is actually true. And something that actually isn't beautiful is beautiful. It's because the devil, the world, and the flesh takes our consciences, which need to be defended. They need to be formed. It takes our receptors of these things and slides a prism in front of it. Our goal in forming our conscience, our goal in forming our ability to know and to love, to be truly free, well, the way humans are meant to be, is to reach out and to shatter that prism. To overcome the temptations and the manipulations and the poisoning of the world, the flesh, and the devil. Take something like food. I really like food. Why? Because food is a good, and thank God for it. Food is tasty. Food is nutritious. But what happens with the devil is when he slides that prism in front of me, I look at a McDonald's French fry and say, that's good. Which is a big lie. It tastes good. But food is more than just taste. Food is nutrition, most importantly. And what the devil does in all ways, throughout our reception of truth, goodness, and beauty, he takes the principal natural element of these things, strips them away, but leaves enough for our twisted and broken conscience to recognize it as true, good, and beautiful, and to thank him for ruining it. We're more grateful to receive a McDonald's French fry and milkshake than we are to have broccoli and Brussels sprouts in front of us. But let's be honest, the broccoli and Brussels sprouts are more food than that overly processed French fry and that dairy substance milkshake, right? Apply this across the board, and this is what the devil does. Our next few talks are going to enter into a greater appreciation for how we actually receive and appropriate truth, goodness, and beauty to make our souls alive, to give our spirits flight, and to examine in a more specific way the tactic of the devil, the world, and the flesh in manipulating our reception of those so that we can overcome him. The transcendentals are nothing more than what your human spirit already intuits. Truth, goodness, and beauty. They come from God because they are God. And we want to return to God what he has shared with us. Our enemy, the world, the flesh, and the devil must be overcome to do this. So come for the next few weeks to learn how to better appreciate and to enjoy the gifts of truth, goodness, and beauty. All right.